I froze when I took my mother-in-law out to lunch and saw my wife and her lover together. She was smiling. The kind of smile that we believe is only ours, the one that, for years, I swore was only given to me. A smile full of lightness, of intimacy, as if he had known her for a long time. As if they shared more than just lunch. As if I, her husband, had never existed. The fork trembled in my hand. My throat went dry. My entire body screamed silently. Beside me, my mother-in-law was talking about the house renovation, while her daughter, crossed her legs and touched the other man's hand across the table, looking into his eyes as if looking into the future. The detail that destroyed me was not seeing her there. It was her lightness. She seemed happy. Much happier than she had been with me in the last few months. At that moment, my world fell apart, but my protective instinct spoke louder. I could have told her right away, I could have made a scene, I could have destroyed everything in front of her mother's eyes. But no. I loved her. I still did. And I thought that maybe she had had a moment of weakness, that it was temporary. That I could still save our family. I made up some excuse, said that I had received an important call and that we needed to leave. I took my mother-in-law home as if nothing had happened, my stomach boiling inside, my heart tearing at every step. As soon as I left her at the door, I went back to the restaurant. I entered the dining room with bated breath and walked to their table. They were both laughing. She was touching him. And in that touch there was a complicity that I had never felt before. I looked at her with all the pain of someone who feels replaced, forgotten, humiliated. And I said, with a firm voice, "But my soul in ruins, I came here to have lunch with your mother and I saw this whole scene. You just destroyed our entire relationship, our family. Don't look for me anymore." Her face fell. Her lover turned pale. She tried to get up, but I was already leaving. That's when I heard, with a coldness that I will never forget, "You will regret this." That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I didn't cry. I just sat in the dark of the living room, listening to the clock, imagining the nights she would go out saying she was going to meet a friend, the dinners she would cancel because she was tired, the hurried kisses before bed. Every gesture of hers, once banal, now took on another dimension. And everything started to make sense. The silences. The coldness. Her cell phone always turned upside down. Her absence disguised as routine. It was all part of something bigger. Something she hid masterfully. But that was now exposed, naked, before my eyes. In the following days, she tried to call me. She sent me messages. He cried at my mother's door. But I was determined. I called a lawyer. I organized the paperwork. I handed the documents to her with the coldness I had learned from pain. She received them in silence, her eyes wide, as if she didn't expect me to have the strength to go through with it. It was only then that her despair began. As if she had suddenly woken up from a trance. As if only by seeing the loss did she remember the value of what she had destroyed. But it was too late. I had buried the love I felt. She tried to get closer to our children. She bought them gifts. She made up excuses. She said she was confused, that she didn't know what she wanted. But the children were already old enough to understand. The oldest, in a gesture I will never forget, said to me, "Dad, don't let her deceive you again. We saw how much you suffered." And that was like a seal of approval. The silent approval of someone who also felt betrayed. I kept going. Little by little, with pain, with anger, but I kept going. I rediscovered the pleasure of being with myself. I traveled. I picked up hobbies I had abandoned. I met new people. And on one of those paths, I rediscovered something I didn't even know still existed, peace. I began to see a future. A future without her. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. Meanwhile, she was sinking. Her lover, who had been so present before, began to pull away. Little by little, he began to reveal his true face. He didn't want commitment. He didn't want children. He didn't want responsibility. He only wanted the forbidden. The fire. The adrenaline. And when he realized that real life had knocked on the door, he ran away. He left her alone with the consequences of everything he had destroyed. She came to me again. Crying. Begging. She said she regretted it, that she didn't know what she was doing, that it was all a mistake. But I wasn't the same anymore. I had learned the hardest lesson of my life: if you step on your heart once, you'll step on it again if you leave the door open. What she didn't know is that what started as a betrayal ended with an even more painful discovery. And it all started that afternoon, at the restaurant, when I saw her with him. What no one knew is that that story was just beginning. Because sometimes, the worst punishment is not abandonment, but being abandoned by the person you thought would be there for the rest of your life. But the twist that would change everything was yet to come. She thought she had lost him. But in truth, she still had no idea what was about to happen when she found herself rejected, by everyone. And the way his new love would appear, and where, would be the last piece of a puzzle that she would never be able to put together again. After all, what could hurt more than being left by the one you loved? Maybe it is realizing that he was better off without you. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal. On the contrary, we believe that every choice has consequences. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they show in a raw and realistic way how betrayal can destroy lives, families, and futures. Get ready. What you're about to hear now is an intense story, full of twists and painful truths. Good story. And hold on tight, because this one's gonna leave you without ground. In a neighborhood where the houses had well-painted white fences and the gardens were always well kept, there lived a couple who, in everyone's eyes, were the very picture of what one would expect from a successful marriage. His name was Daniel, a man with a calm demeanor, a direct gaze and an easy smile, always willing to help his neighbors or listen to long stories from acquaintances at the supermarket. He worked as a logistics manager at a medium-sized company and, despite his demanding routine, he made a point of getting home on time to have dinner with his family, to watch his children grow up, to keep what he considered most precious in his life, his house, his home, his wife. She, Isabella, had a classic beauty and a natural elegance that effortlessly caught the eye. She was a literature teacher at a private school and stood out for her intelligence and sensitivity. She used to get lost in old books and keep notebooks with quotes and thoughts about what she read, always searching for depth in human emotions. She had a sweet way of speaking, a careful gesture, and a presence that filled the room in a subtle and striking way. Her love for art and words made her see beauty in small things, like the autumn leaves piled up in the yard or the silences shared during a family dinner. They met when they were still young, at a university conference, when she was presenting an analysis of poetic construction in Neruda's work and he happened to be attending a technical event in the same city. It was in a cafe, between one lecture and another, that their eyes met for the first time. The connection was instantaneous. Soon, their romance blossomed and, 2 years later, they married in a simple ceremony, surrounded by emotional friends and family. Since then, they have built a life based on what many would call solid foundations: respect, mutual admiration, and a routine filled with small traditions that created almost invisible but deeply rooted bonds. On Sundays, for example, family breakfast was sacred, with pancakes made by Daniel and the final touch of cinnamon that only Isabella knew how to perfectly measure. On Wednesdays, she taught until late, and he would leave a note on her desk with encouraging phrases, sometimes a quote from a book he knew she liked, other times just, "I'll wait for you with wine and a blanket." At night, when the children were asleep, they liked to listen to old records together, commenting on the lyrics as if they were still getting to know each other. It was a relationship that, from the outside, seemed unshakable. Their children, Lucas and Clara, were the natural extension of this love. The boy was 10 years old and had inherited his father's calmness and analytical outlook. Clara, at 7, had the same emotional intensity as her mother, a sensitive, creative child, always asking questions that were too deep for her age. Both were surrounded by affection, a solid education and the constant presence of their parents, who took turns attending school events, presentations, and birthdays with the same dedication as those who understand that details build affection. Daniel was proud of the way they raised their children, without shouting, without prolonged absences, with patience, limits and love. However, behind every seemingly perfect routine, there were quieter layers that rarely received words. Isabella, lately, had been feeling a growing restlessness that she couldn't explain. It wasn't exactly unhappiness, nor was it contempt for what she had. It was an emptiness that sometimes appeared in the late afternoon, when she watched the sun set through the living room window and wondered if that was really what she wanted for the rest of her life. There were times when she felt trapped in a structure that she herself had helped to build, as if she had followed all the steps expected of an exemplary woman, but without knowing if that script still represented her. Daniel, on the other hand, did not notice these silences with the necessary depth. He believed that Isabella just needed a break, perhaps a trip, something to break the monotony. He had never stopped loving her, but he had become comfortable with the stability of what they had. He thought that taking care of the house, the children and bringing in the salary at the end of the month was enough. And perhaps it was, for a while. But without realizing it, he began to set aside the spontaneous gestures that had previously been part of his daily life. The notes became sporadic, the conversations more practical than emotional, the lingering glances replaced by the rush to resolve work issues. And yet, there were no fights. There were no screams, no betrayals discovered, no open suspicions. There was only the growing silence between two worlds that were once the same. A silence that Isabella tried to silence with books, new projects, and long afternoons in the school library. A silence that Daniel ignored with more hours at the office, with the television turned up too loud, with a hurried goodnight kiss. Close friends, observing the couple, still saw them as an inspiration. And, indeed, there was something real between them, a shared history, vivid memories. But there were also dead zones. Those parts of the relationship that no one touches anymore. Those internal drawers where unspoken desires, repressed frustrations, old dreams that have lost their meaning are kept. And it was these zones that grew silently, occupying the space that had previously been the light and fresh love of the early years. Even so, Isabella maintained an impeccable routine. She helped her children with their homework, kept the house tidy, and prepared their meals with care. Daniel followed his role with dedication, did maintenance on the house on the weekends, took his children to their appointments, and paid the bills on time. But something invisible separated them, something that still had no name, but that already cast a shadow over their smiles. At night, in bed, lying side by side, their hands no longer reached for each other naturally. And when he fell asleep too quickly, she would stare at the ceiling, thinking about everything he didn't say. Despite this, there were moments of reunion. Small moments when they seemed to recognize each other again. A rainy day when she had a crying fit because of a childhood memory and he hugged her as if he were still that young man in love who promised to take care of her. Or that Saturday when they went out alone, had dinner, laughed as if they were on a first date. They were real moments, but fleeting. As if they were trying, each in their own way, to rescue something they knew was slipping through their fingers. But routine is persistent. And, like water, it shapes stones. Little by little, they returned to silence, repetition, and empty security. Isabella began to ask herself more often what freedom was. Daniel, for his part, said he was grateful for the life they had, but he could no longer feel the same enthusiasm. It was as if they were living a memory of what they once were, trying to keep a flame alive that, although it still existed, flickered with every emotional wind that blew through the cracks. Time passed. The seasons changed. And something was building up in the invisible between them. A feeling that Isabella couldn't name and that Daniel couldn't perceive. What was more dangerous, after all, a fight? Or constant silence, the absence of conflict, living together without urgency? On the surface, they were still the admired couple, the present parents, the respected professionals. But inside, they already felt distant. The love was still there, but faded, like an old photograph hanging on the wall, beautiful, symbolic, but still. What neither of them knew was that a choice was about to be made. A choice that would forever change not only the fate of their marriage, but the perception that each of them would have of themselves, of what had been built with so much care, and that, in a matter of seconds, could be shattered. The month of October brought a colder breeze, and with it, the feeling that something was changing. Not in the weather, but in the subtleties of daily life. Isabella seemed more distracted, her eyes often staring into space, as if she were far away, even when sitting at the table or lying next to her husband. Daniel noticed the increasingly longer silences, the lack of questions about his day, the way she smiled without showing her teeth, as if everything had lost some of its charm. But he didn't verbalize these annoyances. He continued his routine diligently, paid the bills, took Lucas to soccer practice, helped Clara with her homework, prepared dinner on Saturdays and kept the house running with the normality of someone who believes that small problems will solve themselves with time. Isabella, on the other hand, was immersed in an internal conflict that was slowly consuming her. She began to feel that her life was a cycle that repeated itself around others. She felt useful, but not whole. There were days when you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize yourself. The dreams she had in her youth, her artistic ambitions, her literary projects, everything seemed to have been shelved in the name of stability. She loved her family, but she began to wonder if that was enough. The feeling of being seen only as a mother and wife was silently eating away at her, and she no longer knew how to connect with herself. In search of answers, she began to spend more time away from home, saying that she had to prepare classes or review tests. She felt guilty, but also alive. It was as if the outside world was reminding her that there was still something inside her that was pulsing. It was during one of these long nights that she met a man. They met by chance, in a cafe near the school, when she bumped into him as she was leaving in a hurry, dropping some of the papers she was carrying. He helped her, made a witty comment about the volume of the handouts, and they laughed. The conversation was brief, but there was a touch of mutual curiosity there. Days later, they crossed paths again. And then again. Until their conversations became frequent, although always shrouded in an appearance of casualness. His name was André. He had a discreet charm, an observant manner, and a sensitivity that Isabella had not expected to find. She spoke about books with passion, praised their arguments with genuine admiration, and did not hide her interest in their ideas and presence. At first, she thought she was just enjoying some pleasant company, a kind of respite from her suffocating routine. But she soon realized that she was waiting for those conversations. She dressed up a little more for work. She exchanged messages at night, justifying to herself that it was just a friendship. But the excuses the heart makes have an expiration date, and she knew she was entering dangerous territory. Even so, she didn't back down. On the contrary, she began to nurture that bond with more intensity. Daniel, oblivious to what was happening, only noticed that his wife was more lively, more vain. He attributed it to the arrival of spring or to the fact that she was dedicating herself more to her career. He even mentioned, with a slight smile, that he liked to see her like this, more vibrant, more full of energy. Isabella tried to resist, but there was a night when reason was not enough. After a difficult day, André invited her to an unpretentious dinner. She accepted, telling herself that it was just an informal outing. But when their eyes met in the dim light of the restaurant, she realized that she had crossed a line. It was not just company. It was not just intellectual admiration. There was desire, there was tension, there was something forbidden that united them irresistibly. Between smiles and whispered confessions, they touched each other for the first time. A touch that began innocently, but ended with their bodies getting closer in a way that she had not experienced in a long time. That night, Isabella cheated on Daniel for the first time. And the weight of it fell on her immediately, but also confusingly. There was guilt, there was fear, but there was also a euphoria that made her feel alive, desired, rediscovered. In the days that followed, Isabella was plunged into an emotional turmoil. Sometimes she woke up scared, wondering what she was doing with her life. Other times, she smiled to herself, remembering the moments with Andre. The duality tore her apart. She began to avoid Daniel, afraid that he would notice something in her eyes, in her breathing. She changed her habits. She said she was tired. She made up commitments. All to maintain a parallel routine that grew like a crack under the family's feet. Daniel, little by little, felt the distance as an absence without a name. He tried to get closer. He prepared a surprise dinner. He sent flowers to her work. He wrote a note like he had done at the beginning of their marriage. But Isabella, although moved, no longer reacted with the same sparkle in her eyes. The gap between the two grew. The children began to notice. Lucas, more sensitive, began to frequently ask why his mother took so long to return. Clara, more direct, once said that she smelled like a different perfume. Isabella, pressured by the questions, began to get irritated more easily, with evasive answers and a distance that made the children feel insecure. Daniel felt all of this. Not explicitly, but as a restless presence in the house. That feeling that something was out of place, but not knowing where to look. And then came the day of lunch. A sunny Saturday. Daniel had arranged to take his mother-in-law to lunch at a new restaurant, as a gesture of affection, as part of a larger plan, to try to reconnect family ties. Isabella left early that day, saying she had to meet a coworker to review some reports. Daniel didn't suspect anything. When he arrived at the restaurant, he was chatting calmly with his mother-in-law when his eyes, by chance, turned to the side of the dining room. And then time stood still. Isabella was there. Sitting. Holding hands with another man. Her head tilted slightly forward as he whispered something in her ear. She was laughing. A sincere, light laugh, without apparent guilt. The kind of smile she hadn't given her husband in a long time. The kind of look that, in the past, had been reserved only for him. Daniel froze. He felt his face tingle. The fork slipped from his hand. A part of him wanted to stand up and explode. Scream. Show that mother that her daughter was destroying a family. But another part, more rational, more suffering, stopped him. With a calm gesture, he made up an excuse to leave. He said he had to go to the car to pick up a package. He stood up with his heart beating in his chest like an out-of-time drum and left the restaurant. Outside, he stopped for a few minutes. He had to decide what to do. The image of his wife with another man still burned in his eyes. He felt anger, pain, disbelief. But also a sudden serenity. As if, at that moment, everything had finally fallen into place. The silences. The apologies. The distancing. He took a deep breath. He went back into the hall. He walked towards their table. They hadn't noticed him yet. He stopped in front of them. Isabella looked up. And her expression, when she saw him, was something between shock and terror. Daniel, in a firm voice, without raising his tone, said only what he needed to say. And at that moment, the truth came to light. The betrayal was no longer an invisible ghost. It was real. It was there, alive, among plates and glasses of wine. Isabella tried to react. She said something, but was interrupted by the impotence of someone who knows that there are not enough words to explain the ruin that is setting in. Her lover stood up, confused, trying to look dignified. But Daniel didn't give her any space. He just looked at her. He said it all with one look. And he turned away. She tried to follow behind him. She called out to him. But he didn't answer. He went on his way like someone who finally accepts the death of something that, once, was everything. What Isabella didn't know was that what had just happened was just the beginning. Because there was still a secret to come. And that secret would change everything once again. That night, the silence in the house was absolute. The dark rooms, the empty hallways, the smell of dinner that had been prepared and abandoned, everything seemed part of a scenario of the end. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed with the envelope still sealed in his hands. The lawyer had been quick, efficient. Inside that envelope were the documents that would initiate the divorce. A whole life translated into cold pages, clauses, amounts, shared custody, division of assets. Nothing there mentioned the birthdays celebrated with simple cakes, the movies watched cuddled under the blanket, the sleepless nights when Clara had a fever, or the first, "I love you," said with a voice choked with emotion. Everything had been transformed into legal terms and goodbyes. He didn't cry. The time of raw pain was over. All that was left now was exhaustion. An empty soul. The complete emptiness of someone who had felt everything and now felt nothing. He handed the papers to Isabella the next day, without beating around the bush. She took the envelope as if she were holding a very hot object. She tried to argue, to talk about regret, confusion, and the love that still existed. But Daniel just said that it was the right thing to do. There was no more dialogue possible. He didn't hate her, and perhaps that was the most painful thing for her. Because the opposite of love wasn't hate, it was indifference. And she could feel, in that serene and distant look, that he was no longer fighting. She had lost him forever. In the days that followed, Isabella began to implode inside. Her lover gradually distanced himself, as if waking up from a trance. He no longer responded to her messages as quickly, and he no longer smiled enthusiastically when he saw her. The heat of the transgression had passed, and now he seemed to notice the complexity of the situation. A man who desired her in mystery, but who retreated in the face of reality. Isabella tried to pretend that everything was fine, but the echo of abandonment began to scream louder. She tried to reconnect with her children, but found closed doors, suspicious looks, and cold hugs. Lucas, one day, told her coldly, "You chose another path, now you learn to walk it alone." Clara said nothing, but the absence of her presence by her mother's side was more cutting than any words. It was at that moment that Isabella began to feel the weight of what she had lost. Not only her husband, but his admiration, respect, and complicity. She was alone. No matter how hard she tried to reconnect with the man who had destroyed her family, he no longer saw her the same way. One day, without warning, he broke up with her. He said she was too confused, that there were too many things involved, that he had no room for a drama of such family proportions. For the first time, she realized the abyss. She cried for hours. She tried to call Daniel, but he didn't answer. She sent messages, tried to see the children, but no one answered. And then, in a desperate attempt to regain some dignity, she decided to go to his house, where he now lived with his children, after leaving their old house. She arrived by surprise. She was thinner, her face was haggard, her hair tied up in a hurry, and her look was a mix of fear and hope. She rang the doorbell and waited. Daniel opened the door. He was calm. He was wearing simple clothes, with an apron stained with sauce. The smell of pasta was coming from the kitchen. Behind him, Clara and Lucas were laughing with a woman. She had light brown hair, a welcoming smile, and seemed to feel comfortable in that house. Isabella froze. Not out of jealousy. But because she realized, in that moment, what she had really lost. Daniel looked at her, took a deep breath, and asked what she wanted. She, trembling, asked for a minute. She said she needed to say something. One last request, one last explanation. He hesitated, but left and closed the door behind him. They walked to the garden, in silence. She began to speak with a choked voice. She said she had gotten lost, that she didn't know what she was looking for, that it had all been a mistake. She said she had learned the hard way that not all that glitters is gold and that now, finally, she understood what love was. She asked for forgiveness. She begged for a chance to be heard. Daniel listened to her calmly. But he didn't say anything. He just watched. She continued, slowly breaking down, until her voice became a whisper. And then he finally spoke. He said he didn't hold any anger. That life sometimes pushes us to make the wrong decisions. That she did what she thought she needed to do. But that he had already moved on. That the children were fine, and that he was fine too. Isabella burst into tears, sat down on the ground in the garden and said, through her tears, that she now understood what she had lost. But before saying goodbye, she revealed something she had kept under lock and key, something he didn't know, something that would make perfect sense, but that would also destroy any shred of compassion. She said that her relationship with André had not started by chance. That the meeting at the cafe had been real, but that the involvement was not impulsive or natural. She revealed that she had already known his name before their first conversation. That she had heard stories about Daniel's work, about a layoff that had occurred years ago. And that André was that man. The fired employee. The one who, without proof at the time, accused Daniel of having unfairly removed him from a leadership position. That he had held a grudge for years. And that, when he discovered that Isabella was that man's wife, he planned the approach coldly, strategically. And that she, even after finding out this, continued to get involved, believing that she could do things differently, that feelings could cure bad intentions. But now she saw that everything had been manipulated. That André had gotten closer to her to get revenge. That he had not only seduced Daniel's wife, but had tried to destroy what he loved most. Daniel looked at her as if he were watching a fire that had already been controlled. The shock was silent, profound. It wasn't just marital betrayal, it was something more cruel, more planned, more perfidious. She hadn't just fallen in love with another man. She had been an accomplice, even if unconsciously, to someone who wanted to hurt him deliberately. There were no tears in his eyes. But there was a new emptiness. A deeper silence. He thanked her for telling him. He said that everything made sense now. And, with frightening calm, he said that there was nothing more to say. He went back inside. He closed the door. And left her there, sitting in the garden, amidst the fallen leaves, facing the real weight of her choices. That night, Isabella walked the streets aimlessly, feeling a total lack of belonging. Her lover had disappeared. Her children were far away. The man she swore to love, whom she had betrayed, didn't hate her, but he no longer cared either. And that was perhaps the final blow. There was no going back. There was no home. There was no place. Only the devastating certainty that sometimes you don't lose everything all at once. You lose it little by little, one gesture at a time, until, when you reach out your hand, there's no one there to hold it. Isabella did not return home that night. She spent hours walking aimlessly, wandering the streets, ignoring the cold that was beginning to bite into her skin, lost in a whirlwind of memories, humiliation, and guilt that was now taking on more complex and definitive forms. Each step echoed the awareness that there was nothing left to save. The time for doubt, for chances, for possible solutions, had passed. What remained was what she herself had built with her choices, or destroyed with them. She did not seek shelter, did not call anyone. She wanted to feel, to the limit, what it was like to be alone, without her husband, without her children, without her lover, without excuses that would spare her from the truth. The next day, the principal of the school where she taught called to find out why she hadn't shown up for her first class. Isabella, still with a slurred voice, said she was sick. It wasn't a lie. She was sick with regret, exhaustion, and the pain of having become someone she no longer recognized. In the days that followed, he remained silent. He no longer tried to contact Daniel or the children. His mother called every day, worried, but she didn't answer. Ashamed, unable to even look in the mirror. In the solitude of a rented apartment, where she now lived alone, she began to write letters. Not to send them, but as an attempt to understand where, exactly, she had begun to lose herself. She relived scenes from the past like someone watching an old movie and trying to pinpoint the exact moment when everything began to fall apart. She discovered that it hadn't happened all at once. It had happened little by little, with silences tolerated, gestures left aside, desires shelved. But the final mistake, the one that sealed her fate, had been hers alone. Meanwhile, life in the other house took on new contours. Daniel juggled work commitments and taking care of his children. The woman he had met at the school's parent group meetings, Sophia, started to come over more often, with the ease of someone who didn't want to invade anyone's space, but offered real support, attentive presence, and unhurried affection. Lucas, who at first seemed more resistant, gradually opened up, won over by the way she listened to him. Clara, more sensitive, started to imitate her in small gestures, like making juice with mint or sorting clothes by color. Daniel didn't force anything. He knew his children needed time. And he also knew he needed it. But there was a respite there, in that rebuilt routine. A new kind of peace. Something that had nothing to do with replacing, but with starting over without having to carry the past with every step. A few weeks later, one unexpected afternoon, Isabella showed up at the children's school. She didn't tell anyone. She just walked in, crossing the courtyard with her eyes down, and stopped in front of the coordinator, asking to speak to Lucas. The woman hesitated. She knew the whole situation, but she allowed it. When the boy appeared, his eyes narrowed when he saw her. Isabella tried to smile, but her insecurity was evident. She said she needed to talk, that she missed him, that she just wanted to hear his voice. Lucas, with precocious maturity, replied that he wasn't ready. That it wasn't fair for her to show up there, in an environment that he now considered safe. That it had already been hard enough to accept everything that had happened at home. And that, as much as she missed him, she couldn't pretend that the wounds had healed just because she was sorry. Isabella, in tears, asked for a hug. He refused. He said he had to go, turned his back and walked away. She stayed there, alone on the bench in the courtyard, staring at the ground. Later, the principal called Daniel and reported what had happened. He was silent for a moment. He thanked her for the information and hung up. His ex-wife's attempt did not surprise him, but it did make him deeply uncomfortable. Not because she was insistent, but because she knew Lucas would suffer in silence. That night, she sat next to her son in the living room and, without forcing him, asked him how he was. The boy took a deep breath and said he did not want to talk about it, but thanked her for asking. Daniel respected her request. He offered her silence and a hug. Clara, unaware of anything, was drawing on the kitchen floor, singing a song she had learned from Sophia. The following Sunday, Isabella sent a letter. Daniel opened the envelope with trepidation. The text was intense and honest, but it no longer stirred the kind of emotion she had expected. She said she understood that he no longer loved her, but that she wanted to find a way to rebuild, at least, a bond as parents. She said she didn't want to be remembered only as the woman who destroyed everything. Daniel, when he finished reading it, didn't know whether to respond. He spent 2 days thinking about it. And on the third, he decided to call. Her voice on the other end of the line was low, almost unrecognizable. He said he was willing to talk, but with a broker. He suggested meeting in a neutral space, with a therapist present. She accepted immediately. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, in a quiet office. When they saw each other, there was an awkward silence. Daniel was calm. Isabella seemed smaller, more restrained, with an expression that mixed anticipation and fear. The therapist welcomed them, established the rules of the conversation, and invited them to talk. Isabella began. She spoke of the sleepless nights, the guilt that consumed her, the weight of having given up everything. But, mainly, she spoke of the regret of having ignored what really mattered, the gaze of her children, the dedication of her husband, the construction of a story that now seemed too distant. Daniel listened, without interrupting. When it was his turn, he said that it was no longer about pain or resentment. He said that he was focused on the present. That, despite everything, he wanted to see his ex-wife in balance. Because, deep down, she was still the mother of his children. And that her well-being would also reflect on them. The therapist encouraged them to set clear boundaries. Isabella asked, her voice trembling, to see Clara. She said that she felt her daughter's absence as an open wound. Daniel agreed to supervised visits, at times that would not affect the school routine. It was a start. A cold one, but a start. After the session, Daniel went straight to pick up his children from school. On the way, he didn't say anything. He just turned up the radio and let the music fill the still fragile spaces of what he was rebuilding. The following week, Isabella met Clara. The girl was quiet, holding hands with Daniel, but she agreed to see her mother for a few minutes. Isabella knelt in front of her, looked into her eyes and said that she missed her every day. Clara didn't answer. She just rested her head on her father's shoulder. Isabella cried silently, without drama. When the time was up, Daniel took her back to the car. On the way, Clara asked if that would happen again. Daniel said only if she wanted to. The girl remained silent, looking out the window. While Isabella was slowly trying to re-establish some contact with her children, André reappeared. He called her without warning, one random afternoon, saying he wanted to talk. Isabella, hesitant, accepted. They met in a discreet bar, without glamour, without promises. He seemed different. Tired, direct. He said he had thought a lot about what they had done. That he was not proud. That he knew that, deep down, it was never about love. It was about power, about old wounds. He said that, in the beginning, he used Isabella as an instrument, but that later, when he realized she was really involved, he backed off for fear of destroying himself along with her. Isabella just listened. He said he was leaving, to another state. That I needed to start from scratch. She nodded. There was no more hatred, no desire. Just a mutual feeling of ending. That same night, when she returned home, Isabella looked at the empty apartment and finally understood that she was no longer the same woman who had started it all. That there would be no going back, but there could be reinvention. That Daniel was already a different man, and that her children would need time to rediscover her, if they wanted to. And that she, above all, needed to reconnect with that version of herself that had once been strong, loyal and whole. Daniel, in turn, watched his children grow up with renewed care. The wounds were still there, but they no longer bled. Sophia remained by his side, with ease, without impositions. There were days when he found himself smiling for no reason. And he understood, with the maturity of the pain he had experienced, that happiness did not come from the absence of suffering, but from the courage to rebuild after the storm. Autumn was advancing and dry leaves were piling up on the sidewalks as a reminder of what was once alive and was now part of the ground. Life around her continued on, but within each of those characters, something had changed profoundly. Isabella spent her days in her silent apartment, where every corner seemed to echo the absences she herself had constructed. She no longer wrote letters, no longer waited for connections. She had stopped trying to predict her children's gestures and learned not to force paths that were no longer under her control. Time, which had previously pressed her, now seemed to expand, as if she had finally understood that certain pains could not be rushed, and that regaining trust was like planting in parched soil. It required constancy, care, and the humility of not seeing fruits immediately. Meanwhile, Daniel calmly dedicated himself to the new phase. The children adapted well to the routine with Sophia, who became a present figure, but never imposing. She understood Lucas' silences and respected Clara's fears, creating spaces of emotional safety without trying to take the place that was not hers. Daniel saw in this not only maturity, but a rare type of love, the kind that cares even without promising anything. And although there were still days when old memories passed through him like a cold breath, he knew that what he was building now was different. No longer based on the ideal image of a perfect family, but on the naked truth of someone who had seen everything fall apart and chose to rise again, even with scars on display. Isabella received a new offer to work at a small publishing house that published literary essays. It was a more solitary space, but one where she felt useful, heard, and where she could delve into dense texts that matched the moment she was living. She spent her days reviewing reflections by other authors on losses, reconstructions, and the paradoxes of the human soul. Sometimes, she cried when she found in a sentence written by someone else what she still couldn't say about herself. She no longer sought to justify herself. She understood that part of the punishment she received did not come from the rejection of others, but from the mirror she now faced daily, where she had to live with the awareness of who she was and what she allowed to happen. Clara had agreed to see her mother again. It was a brief but pleasant encounter. They sat in a park, talking about school and music lessons. Isabella didn't ask any painful questions or make any promises. He simply listened, answered honestly, and offered her a hug, which she reluctantly accepted. When they said goodbye, Clara didn't look back, but she didn't cry either. Daniel found out about the encounter later, on his daughter's initiative, and he simply listened, without judgment. When she finished telling him, he told her that he trusted her to know what was good for her. It was a silent but revealing moment. There was no more tension, just a sense of acceptance of the new directions they were all taking. Lucas remained more withdrawn. He did not object to his mother's visits, but he also showed no signs of wanting to reconnect emotionally. When questioned, he would simply say that he was fine and that he preferred to be left alone. Daniel knew that this type of emotional restraint was dangerous, so he carefully suggested that Lucas return to therapy. The boy agreed. During the first session, he did not say much, but he left with less tense eyes. For the first time in a long time, Daniel had the feeling that his son was beginning to find his own way of dealing with all of this. Sophia, on the other hand, remained firm, even knowing that her presence in that house was still temporary in the eyes of others. She never pressured Daniel to make any definitions or promises. She was there because she wanted to be. I knew that true love is not born out of necessity, but out of daily choice. And Daniel increasingly recognized in her something that had been lost for a long time, the lightness of feeling accepted exactly as he was, with his mistakes and successes, without the burden of having to constantly prove that he deserved to be loved. One day, Isabella received a call from Clara's school. The girl had participated in a musical performance and asked for her mother to be present. It was the first time this had happened since the separation. When she arrived, Isabella stood at the back of the auditorium, discreetly, avoiding the gaze of the other parents. When Clara went up on stage and began to sing, Isabella was moved. But it was at the end of the performance that something unexpected happened. Clara walked to the edge of the stage, looked toward the audience and, with a shy gesture, waved to her mother. A brief, almost imperceptible wave, but enough to make Isabella burst into tears. This was not forgiveness, it was not complete reconciliation, but it was a sign. A step. As she was leaving, Daniel approached her. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked her to the sidewalk. Then, in a calm voice, he said that Clara had decided to call her on her own. Isabella confirmed that she knew, that she would respect her daughter's timing, and that she didn't expect anything more. Daniel looked at her sideways, with a mix of compassion and distance, and said that he admired the way she was dealing with everything, even without applause. Isabella thanked him. And for a second, there was a different connection between them. Not that of a couple, not that of former lovers, but that of two adults who had survived the fall of their own world and, somehow, kept walking. A few days later, Lucas went to his father and asked if he could spend an hour with his mother, without Clara present. Daniel, surprised, accepted. When she arrived at the meeting, Isabella was preparing to say no again. But Lucas, bluntly, said that he didn't know if he could forgive her completely. That he still felt angry. But that he wanted to try. He said that he wanted to understand why she did what she did, but that he didn't want excuses. He wanted the truth, naked, without embellishments. Isabella, for the first time, told him everything. She admitted her choices, her mistakes, her vanity, her illusion of freedom. She said that she didn't deserve compassion, but that she would fight every day so that he would at least respect her again. Lucas listened to her in silence. In the end, he just said that he didn't know what he would do with that, but that it had been important to listen. She didn't try to hug him. She just thanked him. That same weekend, Daniel took his children out of town for a day. They went on a short trail and walked through a forest where the leaves formed a golden carpet. They sat by a lake, ate homemade sandwiches, and laughed at old jokes. On the way back, in the car, Sophia slept against the window, Clara had her head on her father's lap, and Lucas was playing with his cell phone. Daniel looked in the rearview mirror and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: completeness. It wasn't the absence of pain, but the presence of peace. A silent, mature peace, built brick by brick with firm, difficult, but honest choices. Meanwhile, Isabella was finding herself again. There were nights when she would wake up in the middle of the night with nightmares about the past. But there were other nights when she slept soundly, with the clear conscience of someone who was finally living the truth. She began to give short lectures on literature and human emotions. The audience was small, but she spoke with passion. One afternoon, as she was finishing one of these lectures, a woman approached her, took her hand and said, "I saw pain in your speech, but I also saw hope. Thank you for not giving up on your story." Isabella smiled, and for the first time in a long time, that smile was complete. Because now she knew that she still had a lot to build, not in the past, but from now on. On that gray morning, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen while Clara packed her pencils into her backpack and Lucas finished tying his shoelaces, distracted by a message on his cell phone. Daniel watched them both in silence, leaning against the doorframe, reflecting on how, in such a short time, the house that had once been the scene of the most intense pain of his life, now exuded a new kind of harmony. It wasn't euphoria, it wasn't absolute relief, it was just peace, and that was more than enough. Sophia, on the other side of the room, was emptying the dishwasher, quietly singing a song that Daniel didn't know, and smiled when he realized that, even without being called, he was already part of it all. They hadn't had the talk yet, nor sealed anything with labels or promises, but he knew he was in a safe place, with someone who understood the silences and welcomed the weight that still remained on his shoulders, without demanding that he stop feeling it. After taking the children to school, Daniel took her to have coffee at a new bakery. They sat by the window and for a long time, they didn't say anything. It was she who broke the silence, with a soft voice, asking if he was still afraid of starting over. And he, without hesitation, replied that the fear existed, but that for the first time it didn't paralyze him. She squeezed his hand under the table and smiled. In that gesture, there was more intimacy than in many nights he had spent during his previous marriage. Meanwhile, Isabella was spending the weekend in a house lent by a childhood friend, on the edge of a more remote region. The place was simple, surrounded by tall trees, with large windows that let the wind circulate freely. There, she allowed herself to reorder her thoughts, far from the noise of the city and the silent demand she still felt in the eyes of those around her. For the first time in months, she was without a cell phone, without a watch, without the urge to fix everything immediately. She had taken with her only a notebook and some books, with the purpose of writing not about what had happened, but about what might come next. It was in this setting that she began to rediscover small joys: the smell of bread baking in the wood-fired oven, the sound of the wind blowing through the dry leaves, the pleasure of sitting alone at the table and feeling whole, even in silence. On Sunday afternoon, she received a letter. It was unusual for someone to communicate like that back then, but the familiar handwriting on the envelope made her shiver. It was from Clara. Without much introduction, her daughter wrote saying that she wanted to see her once more, but this time alone, in a place she had chosen. She set the day and time, asked her mother not to tell anyone and to arrive punctually. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. She knew that it was no ordinary letter, and that Clara, so young and yet so aware, would not write this if she were not ready for something important. She spent the following days anxiously, trying not to get her hopes up, but inevitably imagining all the possibilities, from a reconciliation to a definitive goodbye. The meeting was scheduled for an old park where they used to have picnics when Clara was still little. When she arrived, Isabella was surprised to see her daughter already sitting under a tree, with 2 small bottles of juice beside her. She approached slowly, not wanting to break the moment. Clara looked up, smiled slightly and indicated with her head that her mother could sit down. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. They only listened to the sound of the leaves being blown by the wind. It was Clara who started the conversation, saying that she had thought a lot about everything, about the pain, about the changes, about the silences and the fears. She said that she still didn't know what to feel when she looked at her mother, but that she wanted to say some things that had been bottled up for a long time. With rare maturity, Clara expressed the feeling of having been left behind, as if she wasn't important enough for her mother to fight for her at the most critical moment. She said she felt angry, yes, but that the hardest part was the confusion, the effort of trying to understand how someone who always said he loved them could make such self-destructive decisions. Isabella listened to everything with her head down, tears streaming down her face. When he had the chance to respond, he didn't try to defend himself. He just said that he asked himself that every day too. That there wasn't a moment when I didn't wish I could go back and do things differently. But since that was impossible, I wanted to at least be able to show that I was trying to be better now, even if that didn't erase anything I had done in the past. Clara nodded. Then she took a photo frame out of her backpack. It was an old photo of the 2 of them, laughing with their mouths open on a beach, covered in sand. She said she had found that image and that, when she looked at it, she remembered a version of her mother that she still wanted to find again, even if it was just a piece of her. Isabella held the photo with trembling hands. That gesture was worth more than any words. Daniel found out about the meeting a few days later from Clara. She told him calmly, and he listened respectfully. He didn't praise her or question her, he just said he trusted her judgment. This was what he had been learning over time, that loving a child also meant allowing him to create his own bonds, even with those who had hurt him, if that was what he wanted. That night, when he went to bed, he felt that a cycle was truly ending. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because everyone was finding their own paths to healing. At the same time, Sophia received an offer to work in another city. It was an interesting opportunity, at an institution where she could develop a project focused on inclusive education. When she told Daniel, he listened attentively, but his expression darkened for a moment. She noticed, but waited. He finally said that he would support her in any choice. That he didn't want to be the reason for her to give up something important. She, in turn, asked if he wanted her to stay. And for the first time, he didn't answer with words. He just pulled her into a long hug, and there, in the silence of the gesture, she understood that he did. But she also understood that he loved her in a new way, without holding her back, without demanding, without fear. In the following days, she decided to turn down the offer, but not for him, for herself. She said that her work there wasn't over yet, and that she also had projects that could grow in that place. Daniel respected her decision, but he didn't hide his relief. Isabella returned to work more focused. Her colleagues noticed the change, not only in her appearance, but in the way she approached her tasks. There was no longer any urgency or tension. There was commitment. She received an invitation to give a lecture at a local university on the role of literature in redefining human pain. At the end of her speech, she received a standing ovation. A student approached her and said that she had felt every word as if it were meant for her. Isabella smiled humbly and, as she left the auditorium, felt that she was finally fulfilling a purpose that no longer involved explaining herself, but transforming. One afternoon, Daniel picked up his children early and took them to a book fair. While Clara was leafing through novels and Lucas was lost in mystery stories, he bumped into Isabella. They were both alone, and the initial awkwardness soon gave way to a calm conversation. They talked about their children, work, and life. No accusations, no resentment. Before saying goodbye, Daniel said he was happy to see her well. She thanked him. And before leaving, he added, looking into her eyes, "We didn't win together, but at least we survived apart." Isabella nodded. In that sentence, there was a recognition she never knew she would ever receive. On the way home, Daniel watched his children laughing in the back seat. Sophia was waiting for them with an apple pie in the oven. When he opened the door, Clara ran to tell him about the book she had bought, and Lucas asked to watch a movie together that night. Daniel responded with a smile and, before closing the door, looked up at the sky one last time. It was late afternoon, and the golden light crossed the room with rare delicacy. He closed his eyes for a moment and silently thanked him. Not for having won, but for still being there, whole. In the last week of December, the days were getting longer, the sun was shining brightly through the curtains, and the city seemed to breathe a different rhythm, as if, despite itself, everyone was being pushed by a collective desire to start over. In that atmosphere of the end of a cycle, Daniel was organizing the living room for a small New Year's celebration. Nothing grand. Just him, his children, Sophia, and some close friends. A simple dinner, soft music, light laughter, and sincere hugs. While Lucas helped hang some lights and Clara put together napkin holders with colorful origami, Daniel watched them both with a distant look. Not with sadness, but with reverence for time. Many things had been ripped out by force, but there before him was living proof that some roots can withstand even the most merciless storms. He felt whole, not because everything was resolved, but because he had learned that true peace is not the absence of scars, but the ability to live well despite them. Sophia, sitting at the table, was writing thank you cards to some parents at school. When she finished, she placed one of them on the sideboard in the hallway with Daniel's name handwritten on it. He read it that night, alone. Inside the envelope were just a few words, but they weighed like gold. Thank you for letting me love you exactly as you are, and for allowing me to be your shelter without costing you your freedom. He held the card for a few seconds before putting it away in a book. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he was sure that he would never again accept a love that forced him to disappear in order to be accepted. Sophia had shown him that it was possible to love without ceasing to exist, and that in itself was already a huge victory considering the history they had both gone through to get there. That same night, Isabella watched the fireworks from the balcony of the apartment where she lived alone. She had refused invitations to parties, preferring the company of her own silence. She was serene. The pain that had once crushed her was now part of her body, like a bone that had once been fractured and, even after healing, still throbbed on cold days. She no longer sought approval, nor punished herself with repeated questions. She understood that losing was inevitable, but losing herself completely was optional, and she had refused to allow that. She had rediscovered small joys, writing columns that were published in local newspapers, walking in the late afternoon with headphones on and looking at couples without envy, but with the awareness of someone who had once had, lost and learned from them. She missed her children, of course, but now she understood that true love needed to respect spaces, and not pressure them. Clara sent short but constant messages. Lucas, from time to time, responded with dry phrases, but he was present. Isabella knew that she might never be loved as she once was, but she also understood that each gesture of theirs was a silent vote of hope. In the first week of January, Isabella was invited to give an interview about emotional reconstruction through literature. During the conversation, she spoke with a frankness that impressed the listeners. She said that the biggest mistake she made was not cheating, but neglecting everything that really mattered before cheating. She said that everyone is subject to falling, but that few have the courage to look at the ground they stumbled on and understand what was there. At the end of the interview, she quoted a phrase that marked that moment: "Sometimes, you have to lose everything to understand what you should never have let slip through your fingers." She left the studio feeling light-hearted. She didn't feel like a victor, but she was no longer a victim either. She had become whole, even if in a new, different, imperfect way. Sophia continued to build her space naturally. She never forced Daniel's children to behave in a forced manner. On the contrary, she listened to them, understood their limits and welcomed them without any pretense of replacing them. On a random Sunday, while Clara baked cookies next to her and Lucas corrected his schoolwork on the couch, Sophia realized that she was exactly where she should be. Daniel, on the other side of the counter, watched the scene with teary eyes. A feeling that was hard to name took over him. Something between gratitude, relief and deep love. He stood up, walked towards her and, in a spontaneous gesture, hugged her from behind. She laughed, turned around and said, almost whispering, "It took a while, but now we're home." He didn't answer. He just kissed her forehead and felt that, for the first time, that was a truth that didn't hurt. When school returned, Clara and Lucas maintained their new routine without any major turbulence. They both began to accept occasional meetings with their mother, without drama, but also without unrealistic expectations. Daniel respected the process. He knew there was no longer any need to control. The trust his children had built with him was solid, but now it was also accompanied by autonomy. They chose, for themselves, how and when to deal with the past. This filled him with pride. Not because they were perfect, but because they were growing up free from the weight of their parents' decisions. They were strong. And this, of all their achievements, was the one he valued most. One afternoon, while reading at the corner cafe, Daniel was surprised by a letter. The sender was Isabella. They hadn't communicated directly in months, and he read it carefully. The letter didn't ask for anything. It wasn't a plea, nor an apology. It was a letter of closure. Isabella thanked him, honestly, for everything he had been, even in the moments when she couldn't see it. She said that she had learned to respect her own journey and that he would always be part of what she had been, even if they were now following completely different paths. In the end, she just wanted him to be happy, truly, with whoever he was, in whatever way he chose. Daniel put the letter away in his document drawer, without anger, without longing. It was just the end of a chapter that had already been closed in silence a long time ago. On her last vacation, Clara showed Daniel a poem she had written. It was about loss, about rebuilding, about understanding that sometimes parents make mistakes, but that children can also choose what to do with those mistakes. Lucas, who was listening from a distance, commented that maybe he should turn all of this into a book. They laughed together. Sophia, sitting on the floor with a glass of wine, said that their family was like a resilient plant, that, even after being pruned, it bloomed with more strength. Daniel agreed. He knew that time had passed, but that the effects of everything they had experienced would still echo for many years. And yet, I was okay with it. Because I had survived. Because I had loved. Because I had been reborn from a shipwreck and learned to swim in deep waters. And so, the story ended with each character in their truth. Isabella found within herself the strength she never sought in others. Daniel allowed himself to love again, without rushing, with firm roots. Sophia showed that it is possible to heal without invading. Clara and Lucas grew up in pain, but without losing their tenderness. Everyone changed. Everyone lost. But, above all, everyone survived. And that, in the end, is what makes a story human. Real. If you've made it this far, leave a comment. Tell me what you thought of this story, which character touched you the most, and what decision you would have made in their place. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, there are a lot of impactful stories coming. This story is a clear reminder that betrayal destroys, not just relationships, but the very foundation that supports homes, children, lives. The wounds it leaves are not visible, but they echo in the silences, in the absences, in the glances that look away and in the bridges that will never be rebuilt. And here's an essential reminder, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. All the stories you hear here are fictions created to show how wrong choices can cost you dearly. Until the next story. And remember, those who love, care. And those who care, do not betray.